If you're not used to such a bassy voice coming out of me, you may need to pay a little extra attention, but I think we can make it through. So last week, we talked about what it meant to trust God, how our actions reflect what we already know about God. I used the image of a boy learning to walk, in that he would take his time and he would trust those of us who he knew would be there to help him out as he stumbled or to help him be picked up when he fell, and how God is a part of that. This week, I would like to use a slightly different image, one that I heard first in my time in seminary. This image is the image of a chair like the one you see on the screen behind me. Now, I don't know if you ever think about this, but every time that you actually sit in a chair, you are declaring your trust in that chair to hold your weight, or as you wiggle around, to continue to stay together. It was actually a year ago now that I was at a Thanksgiving dinner in which someone was sitting in a chair that literally broke in half partway through the meal. That chair was perhaps not trustworthy. At least not by the time we got to that point in the meal. But I think all of us make these sort of flash judgments when we look at a chair. Now, it's a little harder to see on the screen perhaps, but this is an older chair. It's seen better days perhaps. Some chipped paint, some of the hardware is coming loose. And we might look at that chair and say, I'm not sure that chair is too trustworthy. So if we were to take this image a little further and think about what we might do when we see a chair that can't support our weight, well, we might just walk away from that chair and say, I'm going to get a different chair. I'm going to get something newer that might be a little more able to hold my weight. We just walk away. Or those handy and crafty folks among us might decide, maybe I can do something with this chair. Maybe I can add some new hardware. Maybe I can swap out some parts that are broken for some newer parts. Maybe I can paint it up so it looks nicer. Oh, and while I'm at it, that old cushion doesn't look all that comfortable. So maybe I'll replace the cushion. So when I sit down, it'll be much nicer. But then when it's done, the chair is almost hardly recognizable, maybe except for a few little elements from where it began. Now, God is obviously not a chair. I'm not trying to say that we should make idols out of the things we sit on. But I think this does kind of point to the way in which we sometimes interact with our trust with God. When we come to a moment in life, and I think most of us do, if we're truly honest with ourselves, we come to a moment where we might doubt our trust in God, where we might wonder, can God really see me through this? Will God support my weight when I sit down? And so we have a choice. Some of us will make the choice to just walk away in that moment. We'll choose to leave our faith, choose to leave the God that we trusted in. Others of us, rather than working on our own trust issues, will start working on who God is. We might add some new hardware. We might give some paint. We might try to make God a little more comfortable to be around. And this comes in different ways, of course. We might start to talk about God in different ways. We might say that God is really only our God when it comes to religious matters. That God really only works through modern medicine, through people doing the work. That God blesses my choices, even when they're different than what Jesus was talking about in the Sermon on the Mount, because I show up at church on Sundays, so I'm probably okay. But pretty soon, like this chair, the God that we sing hymns about, the God that we talk about on Sunday morning, is very different from the God that we have in our mind, the God we are choosing to trust. And I'm pretty sure that's not what Jesus was hoping that we would do when speaking the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, Jesus was showing us a very different picture of who God is and who God will continue to be in our lives. So let's look at this text. There's a couple times in here where it says, "Therefore I tell you." And the old adage goes, if you see a therefore, you have to ask, what's it there for? And what it's really doing is it's pointing us backwards. It's saying, in this case, since the verse before this was no one can serve two masters, you cannot serve both God and wealth. It's all of these words that Jesus now speaks are within the context of serving God rather than our own ability. So as we go through these next verses, that's why this is a two-part sermon, because you have to remember what happened last week for this one to make sense. So it comes along to this piece about do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Now, even though there's no actual linguistic connection, the word for worry in the original Greek looks a lot like our word marinate. That's how I actually remember in Greek what the word is. And I think that actually, for me anyway, that gives some meaning. Because to worry is not to plan ahead necessarily, not just planning ahead. When you're planning to take a trip, I'm sure at least the list makers among us, myself included, will start making a list of all the things we should pack. That's not necessarily worrying. That's just being prepared. But this idea of worrying that I think Jesus is getting at is the worrying that consumes all of our thoughts, or the majority of our thoughts. And I think what Jesus is pushing us towards is like this person on the screen having so many of these thoughts in our minds that it pushes out everything else. It consumes every ounce or almost every ounce of our thought ability and therefore our action ability. If our mind is focused on worrying, which often turns into trying to control the outcomes of any given situation, we are likely unavailable to see and to participate in what God is doing around us. He goes on to say, is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? Well, yes and no. Jesus is not literally just referring to food and clothing. Obviously, eating is important. I tried to dress appropriately today. Hopefully, I nailed having a matching tie and shoes. But I think what Jesus was saying, if we spend all our time worrying about these things, we'll miss out on some of the deeper things in life. If our priorities get co-opted by these relatively meaningless things, we can often get lost. Again, missing out on seeing what God is doing in the world and how we can participate in it. And we've seen this throughout the Bible. As I mentioned last week, there's the 4 fall stories in the beginning of the first pages of the Bible, where human beings are focusing on controlling the outcomes, essentially not trusting God, but trusting in their own abilities. It's this sort of, we've got this attitude. But one of the humbling things that I really think we should see as we read through all of Scripture is that we don't got this. When we try to control it all and are not listening to the Spirit, not seeking God's wisdom, we mess it up every time. Israel did this throughout the Old Testament. As we come into the New Testament, we see the impetuous Peter responding wrong when he doesn't take the time to listen. We see the churches dividing and churches being self-obsessed. We see violence, we see oppression in our world, we see slavery and racism, the destruction of our environment. We see demeaning of women, people of color, ethnicities, people with different traditions and different religions. We see this even in our ends justify the means ideologies. This is humanity saying, we got this, when we clearly do not. I think Jesus looked back on his scriptures, the Old Testament, and said, I can't let this go on anymore. Jesus offers us the Sermon on the Mount as a new narrative, a new way of living, so that maybe we won't say, I got this, and we'll start to say, God's got this, and I will follow God. And that's where this verse comes in. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given you as well. In much of my reading that I do that talks about church life, they often refer to the traps that churches can fall into. And one of the things that I see on almost every one of these is that churches become so focused on themselves rather than the world around them, the world that we are called to serve and minister within, that they slowly shrivel up and die. This is a cautionary tale and a reality that we run into over and over again as the church. And it happens here too. And it's something we must be mindful of, because there's only so much energy, so much time, and so much that we are able to do. I know this very well. Right now, as I'm feeling this cold, taking my energy, taking my voice, it will take me time to rest and recover. That takes time away from perhaps caring for people in my neighborhood, for showing love to those that I must love. In the very basic way, it means I probably won't go grocery shopping for the next few days, and I won't have those chance encounters at Dillon's or at Weaver's that often are a blessing to me and hopefully are a blessing to others. As we spend all of our time and energy perhaps focused on ourselves disproportionately, it kills the potential of the church to truly be the church. Now, of course, there's no perfect way to do church. There's no perfect way to be a member of a church. There's no perfect pastor in this world. But there is one perfect God, and that God says we will find our lives in losing them. We will find our lives in loving our neighbor, in loving our enemies, in feeding the poor and the hungry, in clothing the naked, and in visiting the prisoner. And of course, keeping our eyes on the people that God cares for the most, who are often the marginalized among us. So as we live into our calling to do these kinds of things, we can hear this assurance that all these things will be given to us as well. But I want to offer a caution in this as well. I want us to be careful not to read this as a bargain or a formula, that if we give a certain amount, we will receive a certain amount. That's the prosperity gospel. That is a false gospel. However, when we hear this coming from a man, Jesus, who wandered the countryside sharing the good news without a formal job or without a means of taking care of himself, he always found food and shelter. Maybe it wasn't always the most comfortable, but he did find himself right where he needed to be. He trusted in God to provide in those times of need. As this passage that we heard goes on, speaking about judging, it's easy for us to look around, maybe even look around us in this room and say, well, at least I'm doing better than them. I'm sharing more, I'm loving more, I'm giving more. But that's not what this is about. This is a time for us to consider, how are we expressing our trust in God? How are we following God in the ways that God is calling us? So may we, as we follow God's calling and trust in God's provision, find all that we need when we find ourselves right where we need to be. Amen.